It is exactly 8:30. It is Tuesday, August the 20th, 2019. Welcome to week 3 of Introduction to Criminal Law. I'm Professor Richard Wright, and I'm going to take the time today to go over the assignments for week 3 and then provide you with a few details about the topics for this week. So let's start out by sharing my screen. Okay, and you can see the information at the bottom here. You see that this is week 3 live lecture, and we'll be here for maybe the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. But I want to remind you that you must attend each lecture or listen to the recording, the archive each week. Key phrase or word will be given. You can see the recordings down here for week 1, week 2, and then tonight you'll see week 3 placed in there. So let's get into the announcement for this week. And this week we'll be talking about crimes against persons. Crimes against persons will be presented. Last week we did crimes against property. So this week, crimes against persons, you're going to see that the crimes against persons are probably more severe because of we're talking about physical injury to people as opposed to dealing with property crimes. So prepare for this assignment. You would read chapters 4, 5, and 6 of your textbook, A Brief Introduction to Criminal Law. I provided you with the PowerPoints to help you to study and to prepare for the quiz that's coming up. You should be aware of the fact that this is the midterm point, and that you will have an exam that'll be due on Sunday. That's the quiz, and then that'll cover chapters weeks 1, 2, and 3. So we talk about the topics of homicide, battery, domestic violence, sexual assault crimes, and then key terms for practice, special circumstances, and so forth. And then remind you that your discussion assignment, what type of homicide is this, is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And that on Tuesday, your reply post, on Saturday, your reply post is due 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And your written assignment, spousal rape, and the quiz, which is timed, will be due on Sunday along with the key phrase. And then you know about adversity as a springboard to success. So let's go right to our course calendar. Here it is right here. You can see this is where we are today. It tells you exactly what I said. Your initial post is due today. Your reply post is due the 24th. And your quiz is due the 25th, which is Sunday. So you want to make sure you have that along with your written assignment and then your key phrase. All right. Then you'll see, moving right along, that we'll be halfway through after this. And I'm going to say this now, that assignments for weeks 1, 2, and 3, if they're not turned in by the 25th, they're going to be late and not accepted. Now, weeks 1 and 2 are late already. week 3 will be late as of the 25th. What I'm saying to you is that starting the 26th with the next week, and by the time we have that lecture on the 27th, which is a week from today, we will be you'll be at the midpoint, and we'll be heading toward the second portion. Okay, you might want to turn your camera off and then activate audio in order to hear. So turn your camera off. You probably can't hear me because you need to activate audio, but the camera should be off, so that make sure you turn off your camera. There we go. Camera is off. Okay, now you got to activate audio in order to hear me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get to Module 3 and the assignments. So you see your discussion assignment that's due. All right, so you're going to take this fact pattern, and then for your initial post, you're going to deal with these 2 points. As the investigating officer, that's what you will be. What charge would you recommend against James? First-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, or voluntary manslaughter? And then explain which law is more applicable to the case and why others are not. And then in your reply post, then you're going to examine other posts, of course, and consider all 3 crimes again, and then explain why you feel more strongly about one of the crimes being charged as opposed to another. Okay, so let me go back and see what is in the chat box. You have to go. Okay, I'll go back into the classroom so that you'll see it. Okay, the way you do it is you go to audio and then do audio connection. And then that's how you do it. Okay. Turn the camera off. Audio connection. See? Audio connection. And then it'll tell you connect audio. That's how you do it. Okay. Okay. Looks like I lost her. So anyway, I got to keep going. So I got to go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So then the second thing is your written assignment is spousal rape. And including in this, you have 2 parts. Part 1, examine the type of crime called. Turn your camera off, but don't turn the mic off. Turn the camera off. Okay, the same way you had it before. Okay, now, there we go. And so now you'll see it's a part 2 and a part 1 assignment. Examine the types of crimes that are committed. And then you use this scenario and you complete each of these 3 points. you'll see it in the rubric. And then the second part, you conduct the interview. Now, remember to complete each of these. Very important that you have 2 parts. Now, the first part is a minimum of 2 pages, not counting the reference page, not counting the cover page. And it's double spaced, and it's APA, which means citations in the body and reference at the end, Roman 12, and you make sure that you have gone through and looked at the APA. I've provided enough resources in previous lectures that I've shared with you about APA, and you can find that information also in your guides down here. If you click on guides, which I won't, you can see, and it'll tell you also about your weekly assignment as well. Okay, so now there's a rubric. You click on the assignment, and it opens up the due date and then the rubric. Here is the rubric, and it tells you what you need to do for part 1. List the elements of the offenses and explain how they have been met. Explain the type of crimes committed and why the initial responding officer mishandled the case the first time. 2 pages. 2 pages double space. And then part 2, conduct the interview, how students will approach the interview with the victim. Identify sensitive questions that need to be asked of the investigating officer, and it meets the 1-page requirement. So the first part is 2 pages, the second part is a minimum of 1 page. And then you satisfy, like I said, APA requirements, and all of this is in here. This is very standard for all of your requirements there. Okay, so this module 3, written assignment, spousal rape. It's a misspelled word, but you know what I'm talking about there. So then I'm going to exit that, and again, that's due on Sunday. So then we'll go back, and then your quiz. Now, this quiz is a time quiz and set for 30 minutes. Remember, you've had a chance to do practice quizzes in weeks 1 and 2. I recommended that you do them. I recommended that you take those practice things as I'm going to go over in today's session. And then also, I recommend that you take this quiz Sunday, because then you would have gone through all the material, and you'll have a chance to go back and review chapters 1 and 2. And what's the best way to review for it is look at the practice quizzes in week 1 and week 2, and then also look at the PowerPoints for weeks 1, weeks 2, and then, of course, for week 3. And that's how you do that. All right. And then your live classroom lecture is also, and you can click on that, and it tells you the due date again, and there it is, which is Sunday. Okay. Same thing if you clicked on the live lecture. The key word or phrase, which you'll hear tonight, is due, and you can put it in there tonight, and you'll be done with it if you're in the live lecture. All right. So that's it for the assignments, and I'm going to close that down. So now let's go into Module 3 itself again, and let's talk about the lesson itself. Let's talk about the things that we're going to talk about. Again, your reading was chapters 4, 5, and 6. And remember, chapter 4, you don't read the whole chapter. The adult section, assault section, not adult, assault section through the end of the chapter. All right. So basically, you have 2 full chapters and a partial chapter. So we're going to talk about the topics of homicide, battery, domestic violence, and these sexual crimes, and then we'll conclude, and then I'm just going to take you over again to remind you about using these key terms, as well as, and these are important, preparing for the quiz, and then the special circumstances, and then the homicide, and then of course there is the practice quiz. Do not, I repeat, do not skip over these, because they will help you when you get to the actual quiz itself, which is a 30-minute quiz. Okay? So let's talk about what homicide is. Basically, homicide is the taking of the life of another. And there could be a lawful homicide, or it could be unlawful homicide, and it depends upon the situation. So, for example, when the police have to use deadly force, as it says, to prevent bodily harm or death to others, this is lawful or justifiable. The same thing can also take place when a person is involved with what we call self-defense, defending themselves, or doing something to prevent bodily harm or death to another individual. On the other hand, if a person is upset, and it says, and intentionally kills a girlfriend because he believes he's cheated on him, it is unlawful and could be referred to as murder. Could be. And the only reason I say that is because in some jurisdictions where the person is upset and they kill the person, then in that case, then it's not going to be murder. It's going to be some form of manslaughter. Now, the thing that makes it murder, if it says intentional, and that's the key thing here. So when something is done on purpose, let's say, for example, you beat somebody to death, you may not necessarily be guilty of murder, but a form of manslaughter, or some jurisdictions have second degree in place of manslaughter in those situations. So we're going to just briefly talk about that. So let's go to the degrees of murder first, just to talk about it. Now, murder itself is generally considered as what this term here is first-degree murder. Now, for purposes of these exams that you're going to take, these quizzes, you want to know first-degree murder and what sets it aside. And so first-degree murder involves two elements. Premeditation. That is that you actually thought about it, you planned it, and you intended to kill the person. So both elements have to be present. So it has to be premeditation and intent to kill an individual. If it's done by accident, it's not going to be first-degree murder. Okay? And when you consider the actions of individuals, it means that you put some thought into doing it. So let me say this. There are individuals, for example, who will, and I'll reserve this till we get to the domestic violence issue, but people kill their spouses in situations where they were involved in domestic violence, and it ends up being murder rather than a defense, or either second-degree murder or involuntary manslaughter. But here, not to confuse you, so let me clarify it. Just remember that when you look at a scenario, ask yourself, say, is it premeditation? That is, there was planning or forethought, and the person intended to kill the person, okay? So if you point a gun at somebody and you shoot them, it is probably not going to be manslaughter. It's going to end up being murder, and probably first-degree murder, because of the fact that it talks about forethought, and what it means here is proven by the actions or the statements of an individual at the time. So let's say, for example, I say, I'm going to kill so-and-so, and then I do something to try to kill them, and they die. Then it's probably going to be murder because the statement is going to be backed up by action. So that's how you know. And the premeditation and statements come before the actual act, okay? And that's where it says in Minnesota, and that's where it is in most jurisdictions. So the elements of causing death, remember, it has to be death. The person has to die. You know, you can't charge a person with murder unless a person actually dies. And it has to be a human being, and it has to be with premeditation, which I've already explained, and the intention of that person to kill the individual. All right. So, given an example here, it says in first-degree murder cases where intent is established, it for example, it says if it's later determined that the killer had another of his intent to kill the victim, and in fact comes out with the action, the statement is used to support the intent. So you say what I just said. I'm going to kill somebody, and then you do it. Now, you have to look at the context of the situation and circumstances as well. And sometimes it says here that intent is not necessarily by words, but it's obvious. For example, if the person witnessed screaming, "You're going to die," and then fire a gun at the victim, then in that case, their statement, "You're going to die," is going to place them in first-degree murder because the act was intentional based upon what was said. So you have to look at the total circumstances. So don't be tricked when you take these exams. And we'll do some practice ones, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Motive could also be uncovered to show that the killer intended to kill someone. For example, let's say you send somebody a message or a note or an email or a letter that you were going to kill them, and then you do steps to take their lives, such as to collect some insurance money or some other reason, then in that case it's considered as first-degree murder. So you have to look at the total circumstances to determine first-degree murder. And first-degree murder is the most serious homicide that's involved here when we start talking about homicides. All right. So now let's close that up and let's talk about what's second degree. Now, second degree murder exists where premeditation is not there. So what happens is that the defendant knowingly caused the death of another. But the element of second-degree murder that lacks murder is premeditation, or the state of mind at the end. So in other words, the act of an individual caused the death of an individual. And like I said again, there is second-degree murder, and in some jurisdictions, second-degree murder is known as voluntary manslaughter. So those are interchangeable in many jurisdictions, when the killing is done without any prior intent or occurs in the heat of passion. That is why when I said earlier that when the person is upset and intentionally kills his girlfriend, that makes it murder in the first degree. But if you take the intentional out of it and just say he's upset and he maybe kills her, then we're going to find ourselves without the premeditation, and it's going to be second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter. And it's all going to be looking at the circumstances of what happened at the time. I've given you enough details about first-degree murder, but remember, there's an element of premeditation that is missing, okay? When the killing is done without intent, prior intent, in the heat of passion. Heat of passion occurs when a person loses control or they go beyond what they would normally do, and then it results in a person being killed, such as beating a person. And we'll talk about some examples. Oftentimes, it talks about here, here's some examples. Heat of passion killings are applied in murder cases when the murder happens immediately in the moment that the person loses control or have irresistible impulse. It'd be difficult to lessen the severity of murder under the concept if Bob came to find his wife in bed with Jim, but then hunted Jim down the next day and killed him. So if he did it, you know, he walked in and he saw her in the bed with Jim and he killed them, it's probably not going to end up being first-degree murder. It's going to end up being second-degree murder. But if he says, I'm going to get them and do it the next day, because remember, once again, we have a cooling off period, and then we have a period where the person has formulated in their mind and thought about it, planned it, and then do it, then we get back to first-degree murder. So that should clear that up for you. Finally, Tennessee lays it out very clearly in their statute. Says the intentional or knowingly killing of another in a state of passion produced by adequate provocation sufficient to lead a reasonable person to act in an irrational manner. Certainly, walking up on and finding someone in the bed with their spouse would probably fit that mode. So would walking up on someone who was maybe, should I say, a younger person having sex with somebody's daughter in their house, or vice versa, or either, you know, it could be two males or something. All kinds of things. The bottom line is that the key thing is that the person is caught by surprise and shocked about it. All right. So that's when you get into second-degree murder or either involuntary manslaughter. The special circumstances, I'm just going to say a little bit about that. Special circumstances, when certain factors intervene and increase the severity of offense. So let's talk about first-degree homicide with special circumstances. The aggravation is that the person, for example, did something with future dangerousness. Anyway, the probability that the defendant would commit the act that would constitute a continuing serious threat to society, and it's done in a very vile, outrageous, or horrible fashion. In that case, then that would be aggravating in terms of aggravating the crime that the person commits of first-degree murder. Second degree, as we've already talked about with special circumstances, the difference is that the element of second degree is knowingly and not premeditated. And but don't be too confused by this. Common circumstances for that is adequate provocation and coercion. Death was because the person was forced to cause it. For example, person is taken hostage, and the hostage taker has a gun to his head. The hostage taker tells the person, shoot the person or I'll kill you. Under these circumstances, such as coercion, duress, Jack shoots Bob. In that case, then, he was under duress. Okay, and then there are some defenses that can be used as well, but you won't have to worry about that too much. So just focus on the first two as your main one. Now let's talk about involuntary manslaughter. Involuntary manslaughter means what it says. It was done recklessly, such as usually that happens with a person who, for example, might have a drunken driving case and a person is killed. Okay, so the level of recklessness is defined by what we call utter disregard, such as speeding, driving under the influence, or something along those lines. And so it results again in the death of an individual. Proving utter disregard is more challenging because it shows that the actions that caused the death was equal to what we call conscious disregard. In other words, you could see that you shouldn't have done it, and you did it anyway, and you can be prosecuted. Talks about here that a person who, and you'll usually run across these fact patterns to help you in preparing for these exams, is that dealing with reckless driving in a residential area and a person is killed, that person is then probably involved in involuntary manslaughter for violating the laws, or reckless homicide, or homicide by using drugs or alcohol. That is, in these cases, the person didn't intend to kill anybody, but because of their recklessness, their actions, driving under the influence, speeding, excessive speed, resulted in the death of an individual. Now, when we get into the degrees of involuntary manslaughter, and then, this kind of like gives some idea, and I'll just read the scenario, talk about it, and then I'm out of this. It says, it's 11:30 on a clear but cold January day, and the streets are dry. So a 23-year-old male named Jim is intoxicated and driving his vehicle in a residential with a 25-mile-per-hour speed limit. His girlfriend, seated next to him, she's drunk also. So what Jim decides to do to impress her, remember, he's trying to impress her. They both are drunk now. And he drives and accelerates it and hits 80, and then drives through a stop sign and results in the death of someone being killed. So the question is, did Jim demonstrate an utter disregard for human life, or were his actions merely reckless? In this case, he probably found himself dealing with utter disregard of human life, because, like I said again, he was intoxicated, and then he speeds up, which could possibly result in injury. Now, some might argue, well, if he was sober, would he have actually taken that dare? But the point of the matter is that he intentionally placed himself in that position by being drunk in the first place and driving, and then that. So, utter disregard for human life, and that would be the result. Involuntary manslaughter, or with what we call the one-punch homicide, can occur in battery cases, which we talk about battery later on in this module. But the term one-punch homicide is used to describe where a person intentionally hit that person or punches that person, but the punch results in the person's death. And we're not going to go over any of those type of situations. You can take a look at these clips on your own. Okay? So you see the difference between voluntary and involuntary. The key thing to remember is that the person plotted, planned it, and did it intentionally. So now let's talk about battery. So what is battery? Battery is very simply a crime committed against an individual where it depends on the type of battery that it is as to how serious it is. So there's aggravated assault, aggravated battery, and so let's break it down. Let's break it down. So by talking about assault, now in some jurisdictions you'll see assault is used for battery, but don't be confused. Don't be confused. For purposes of understanding criminal law and the charges of assault and battery, you'll see the difference based on the definitions that are in here. And it's very simply this. Here it is right here. You see this right here? I got this hand up. You can see it. And you're there. And you're within striking distance. Well, I'm putting you in fear of being hit. All right? Or either I'm pulling a weapon up. Creates a reasonable belief that you can be hurt. But I didn't do anything beyond that. So it says it involves no physical contact. Remember that part. If it's physical contact, then it crosses over to the battery. And what I usually try to explain to people is that usually assaults precede battery. So example, if I raise my hand like I'm going to hit you and then I hit you, I assaulted you first, and then by hitting you, the battery. When someone strikes someone against their will and involves actual physical contact, okay? And batteries can be misdemeanors if they're very simple battery, where a person is charged for just hitting a person and minor injuries. So the injuries determine it. Substantial battery is classified as aggravated assault in some jurisdictions, but usually it involves some weapon or something like that. Now, if you are a boxer or a karate expert or something, your hands are considered as weapons. Therefore, it is probably felonious for you to strike someone and they result in serious injury. On the other hand, as you learn with the one punch, when you look at it, it depends on the severity of how the individual did it. Maybe the punch caused the person to fall down and they hit their head on the ground, but that wasn't your intention. Then in that case, then we're talking about, once again, getting back here to involuntary manslaughter as opposed to manslaughter. But the fact of the matter is that the common elements of battery, this is what you need to remember, is that number one, it was intentional. Number two, that it caused injury, and then it was without their consent. That's it. Those are the three elements that you look for. All right. And that's I'm not going to get into all the states that have assault and battery interchangeably. And so basically, intentional touching, intentional touching is a battery without the person giving permission. All right, and it causes injury. So I'm not going to go over all of this, but I am going to say that this paragraph here dealing with bodily harm, intentionally causing bodily harm is considered what we call simple battery. Okay, but evidence of bodily harm is supported by what the victim reports. That is, whether or not the individual is experiencing pain and so forth and so on. So just doing this, touching somebody, is going to be battery, but it's not going to be battery adequate enough to create a serious offense. It has to result in some injury, some bodily harm. Okay. Mayhem is the most serious form of bodily harm. where a person unlawfully, maliciously deprives a human being of a member of their body, such as cut their arm off, finger, or do something, disfigures an individual, maybe pour acid on them, hot water, or scalds them, or cuts their body, then, and those kinds of things, then we get into mayhem. It's consistently defined, it says, across the country. So here's a scenario for you to look at, and then we can move on from that. You'll get it clear in your mind. This is why I tell students, this is a very good scenario. Every time I do this lecture, I always talk about this scenario, where there's Angela, who's 18, with a 21-year-old male named Drake, and they were both drunk. And Angela and Drake participated in a bizarre ritual in honor of a cult-like activity. Angela consents to the participation. Drake slit her wrist and then drank her blood. I mean, this is really heinous, okay? Then, to clearly show their commitment to the band, that's what she did. So it's like an initiation. Angela allowed Drake to chop off her pinky finger with a meat cleaver. This is really going overboard, but you can see where I'm going. Absent her right pinky, she eventually became lightheaded and was dropped off at a hospital for treatment. She told the emergency room what had happened, and in turn, the parties notified the police. So the question is, did Drake commit mayhem against Angela? Probably the answer is yes, because the definition of mayhem is unlawfully or maliciously depriving the person of a member. It doesn't have anything to do with them saying to do it. So he did commit mayhem. All right? Now, and that's it. So the little line at the bottom, battery occurs when complete strangers, and even among those that love each other. That we'll get to domestic relationships later. Okay, so don't worry about that. Okay, domestic violence is something else. All right. So now, here we come. How do you get domestic violence? And you know, and I know domestic violence. I know it very well because I've explained it to you in how I lived my life as a child. But it is very simply, when it says domestic, it usually involves violence of a person who has some kind of relationship with an individual. They could be spouses, they could be people dating each other, but they're operating in what we call a domestic relationship, okay? And it says here that in most states, the domestic relationship exists that is adequate to cause the crime when two adults, that is at least 18 years or over, live together, or have lived together, or have a child in common. Now remember this, they don't have to be living together, but they have a child in common, which means that they have a domestic relationship that's established by the fact that they are parents of a child. Then the offense of battery would become domestic battery because of the domestic relationship. So it's the relationship that takes place. It could be two males now. It could be two females now. It could be male and female as traditionally. All right? And it is a very serious offense. I remember when I was a police officer and we were trained in the academy, and we were always trained that one of the worst calls that we ever wanted to have was a domestic violence call. And the reason being is because of something that happened to me when I was a law enforcement officer. We arrived at the scene, and the person was beat up pretty bad. And what would happen is that you would see the person who did it. It was obviously her husband or boyfriend, and the situation it was, I forget which one it was, but anyway, we went to grab him. And when we went to grab him, the woman who had called the police and who was apparently beaten up, she got upset with us because she said, "That's my man." And so you have to watch those scenarios. I remember one of my colleagues telling us about a situation where he was on a call, and he got there, and the person was who called the police, female again, was sitting on the couch. And when the person was sitting on the couch, the police were engaging the person who did it, who was her husband or boyfriend, I forget whichever it was, but anyway, they had a domestic relationship, and they were handling kind of rough. And they looked around. One of the officers looked around and told the woman, "Put your hands up. Put your hands up." Well, the woman was sitting on the couch, and she was putting her hand down in the couch, and told her to get away quickly and put a gun on her. Had her move. Guess what she was doing? Can you figure out what she was doing? If you know, you can type it in the chat. What do you think she was doing? If you don't know, I'll tell you. When they moved her away, reached down in there, there was a gun. So she was reaching for a gun to, shoot the police. So that's why we say in domestic violence calls that they can be some of the most serious, because you're a potential a person who could create harm to you as a law enforcement person is the person who called you. So anyway, from a domestic violence perspective, the definition of domestic violence relationships fit these two elements. Two adults, at least 18 years or over, live or have lived together or have a child in common. So that's what you're going to see. All right. So we're going to just scroll down. And I was talking about this right here, and police officers' actions and things like that. And so what usually happens in those situations is that one person is removed from the house, and the person who committed the offense is removed for so many hours. And then there's what we call orders of protection sought out. And the key thing is to oftentimes bring those persons into court for domestic violence, and then usually there's a need for counseling and so forth. Anyway, there's a good video when the batterer wears a badge. I remember that one of the things that we've always learned is that law enforcement officers can sometimes be guilty of domestic violence, and they possess a weapon because they are law enforcement officers. And so there's some real serious issues that relate to that. So you could look at this video, these two links, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay. So now let's talk about sexual assault crimes. So just to sum up, we've talked about domestic violence, and we've talked about battery, and we've talked about murder and manslaughter. All right. So now let's go down and let's talk about sexual assault. So as it says here, the word no means no. No is not based upon the person really means yes, but as soon as the word no takes place, it means what it says. It means stop and cease. Well, at common law, it says rape was the act of unlawful intercourse by a male with a female. And of course, now that's all changed now, other than their wife, without their consent. But today, rape is more appropriately referred to as what we call sexual assault. It's not called rape. and it's gender neutral for obvious reasons, and doesn't require that intercourse actually take place, but also includes an unlawful touching, however slight, of any area of the genital area of an individual with an object or with the person's part of their body. All right, and these crimes are very sensitive in nature because of the fact that it used to be the point that the person who was the victim was interrogated more than the person who committed the offense, but because of what we call rape shield laws, which is commented on in a little bit when we get down here and we deal with other crimes, the fact of the matter is that the individual's sexual activity is not to be used as evidence in a case, in a sexual assault case. So there are various degrees of sexual assault, and basically be aware that if you have any sexual penetration of an individual under the age of 13, it says in Minnesota, is guilty of sexual assault in the first degree if any of the following exists. And you can see all the circumstances. Pretty much lack of consent, or either the person will not give consent. But the key thing to remember is no means no. All right? It is not a defense that a person dresses in a certain way or it seems like they asked for it. All right? And then we get into second degree and third. I'm not going to talk about those various degrees. But what I am going to just simply say to you is that you will notice that the highest degree of criminal sexual conduct involves where you take advantage of younger people, or either you force them, whatever the age, or threaten injury to a person. And then it gets to be where the act itself is not totally carried out, but sexual contact is when you get in the second degree, and then when you get in the third degree, forbids a person from engaging in sexual penetration with another if any of the following exists. The age again kicks in. Okay, the defendant is a massage therapist and the assault occurs during the massage, so the person can go beyond what they're supposed to do, and you hear about those kind of situations. And then you get into fourth degree, prohibiting sexual contact under the circumstances of above in the third degree as well. So then moving on down. The one I want to talk about now, as I conclude this area, is statutory rape. Commonly, statutory rape is what we call a strict liability crime. What it means is that the laws are intended to protect the individual. So statutory rape says laws prohibit sexual intercourse between juveniles under the age of 18, but it varies according from state to state. And so the key thing is, it is not a defense that the person looked like, the person had a fake ID, or any of those kind of things. Statutory rape laws are what we call strict liability laws, which means it's not required to show that intent, but the mere act of engaging in sexual contact with a person who is not at the age to give consent itself is considered as rape. And it is never a defense to say a minor consented. Minors can't consent, or you thought the person was an adult. And so that's where I'm going to pretty much deal with that. And then concluding, due to the sensitive nature of sexual assault crimes, victims are unwilling to come forth. And this is where we come to what I mentioned earlier. Most states have enacted what we call rape shield laws, which are designed to encourage individuals of sexual abuse to report crimes without fear that their prior sexual assault or sexual conduct themselves or relationships would be used in court against them. For example, a defendant will not likely be able to introduce the fact that a victim, a person who is the victim, has a reputation for engaging in sex with strangers. What that did was it created the impetus that individuals didn't want to come forward because of the fact that they then become questioned more than the defendant. But rape shield laws say, nope, it's irrelevant, because what we're talking about is not their history or their propensity with others, but what has happened between the defendant and the individual who's the victim. And that's where it should be, on a case-by-case basis. And so those are the things that I want to talk about today involving crimes against persons, and you have a pretty good idea about it. So now we're going to conclude by, I want to share with you, before I give you what I want to share with you, how to get ready. Again, you got these key terms. I'm telling you, you click on key terms. This is for you. And then you use the flashcards. And then you can do this and allow it and hit that little red thing, and then it'll open it up. Now, and what it does is it gives you some practice ability. So, the intentional causing of death of one human by another without premeditation, forethought, or planning. Intentional causing of death. Remember that key word and watch what you're going to come up with. Second-degree murder, because of the fact that we go back to it intentional without premeditation. With premeditation, it kicks it into first degree. All right? So you got to be knowledgeable about that. And we're going to have some scenarios that I'll give you that will help you. Doesn't require that intercourse took place, but also includes unlawful touching, however slight, of any part of the victim's genital area, or the use of any object in any genital opening without their consent, and we call that sexual assault. Sexual assault itself. Okay? So you got to remember that. Now, special circumstances, you won't have a lot, but here's one. A special circumstance where death was caused because the person was forced, not by their own creation, to cause it under the belief that they were compelled to. So then it turns into coercion or necessity. They did it out of necessity. Each of these. Creating a reasonable belief that harm may occur. All right? That's assault. Creating a reasonable belief that harm may occur. Remember, like I said, raising that hand to hit somebody, that's assault. But a cause of action that shows actual or deliberate intention to harm, if not intentional, shows an utter indifference or conscious disregard for own safety, is considered as utter disregard or indifference, because that means you don't care about what your actions are going to do. The intentional touching or fondling of the victim's intimate parts by any part of the body or any object. We just talked about it. Sexual contact. All right? And so you go over these, and then they will help you to prepare for the exam. All right? So now let's go back to the classroom again, and let's do the next thing. Go over these yourself. Special circumstances. Again, you want to practice special circumstances. It gives you some scenarios to help you. Take the time. So in a word, Jane and Phil been married for 10 years, and they have 2 children together. Okay, Jane and Phil, they have a drinking problem. Jane came home drunk and argued with Phil. Phil threatened to leave Jane and take the children if she didn't get help. Jane shot Phil and fled the house with the children. What special circumstances would likely be claimed in this case? Adequate provocation, future dangerousness, coercion, or necessity? The question that she would argue would be, it was adequately provoked. So let's see what it says. That's right. Likely to be claimed that she was adequately provoked, because you don't take no children away from a woman. All right? Mary and Jane and John have been married for 15 years. Mary discovers that John has been having an affair for the past year. They argue and sleep in separate beds. In the middle of the night, still very upset, Mary stabs John once with a knife while he's asleep. John survives, and Mary tells police she couldn't control herself. What would she likely claim? I'm not saying she'll succeed. Future dangerousness, adequate provocation, coercion, or necessity. So they argue and sleep in separate beds. She was upset, but she stabs him while he's sleeping. All right? So she might try to say future dangerousness because of the fact that they argued. But let's see if that's going to be successful or not. I don't think so. Nope. Adequate provocation would likely be claimed, and that was what I was saying at the beginning, is that adequate provocation, because Mary was so upset with John that she stabbed him in a heat of passion. So that's why you have to be careful about getting caught in there in terms of it. So you can see how she could say she stabbed him, and the circumstance she would say she did it under was adequate provocation. In other words, she was provoked. Now, I didn't say she'd be successful. The final one I'm going to do here is this. Jim went for a hike in the wilderness and got lost. You got to be very careful when you're reading these facts. As night fell and the temperature dropped below 0, Jim believed he was going to freeze to death. Jim broke into a cabin to stay warm. What would be his special circumstances? What do you think? Would be A, B, C, or D? Which one would you think? D, A, B, C, or D? Which one? What would you say if you were Jim and you were saying the reason you did it? Type it in. Which one? You don't know? Pick one. Type it in the chat. I'll see it. A, B, C, or D? Which one? That's it. It's coercion. Because if he didn't do it, he would freeze to death. And then the last one. Sam found himself in an unfamiliar, high-crime area and was approached by a gang member who threatened to shoot him. Sam ran away and broke into a closed business to hide from the gang members. Would it be coercion or necessity? violence, adequate provocation, or future dangerousness? What would be his special circumstances? You know, A, B, C, or D? Would it be violence? Would it be adequate provocation? Or future dangerousness? It's the same one, because he was trying to get away from the gang member. All right. So those are the kinds of things you have to look at. Remember, you're going to have to do them. So that's why I was asking you, take a look at it. It's based upon the material that we discussed, and it's also based upon your reading, more importantly. A couple more. So now let's get into homicide. Now, we talked about homicide quite a bit. So let's see if you know homicide. So you go to this activity. Again, this is to help you. These are fact scenarios. Frank has a long-standing hatred for Kim. Frank purchased a gun and hid in the bushes outside Kim's apartment. When Kim exited, he shot and killed her. What do you call this? A, B, or C? Which one? Let's try it. Think you're onto something. Excellent. Yeah, because he laid and waited. Okay, remember, he premeditated and planned it. Okay, John is a gang member who is involved in an ongoing battle for drugs turf. John tells his gang members that he is going to kill Jose, a rival gang member. John leaves armed with a handgun and kills Jose. What kind of classification? Yep, you getting it. You got it. Okay, excellent. And then last one I'm going to do on this one is this. Jackson and two of his friends are hanging out on the top floor of a parking ramp. Jackson has a violent history, targets another man, Rick, and tells his friends, watch this, I'm going to kill this guy. Jackson punches Rick in the face, picks him up, and throws Rick over the ledge. Rick falls to his death. What is this? A, B, or C? You again are on it because you're not getting tricked. Exactly. First degree murder is the correct answer. He told him he was going to kill him. Remember, I said that. And then he intentionally punched him and threw him over the ledge. And then the last one. Mike is drag racing against Matt in a highly populated entertainment district. Mike drives through a red light and collides with another motorist, killing the driver. What classification is this? We actually had this scenario in it. Yep, very good. Some people would have said voluntary manslaughter, but no, it's because he didn't premeditate it, but his reckless driving caused the death. Okay, so you got those, and you remember those when you take the exam. And then the last thing I'm going to do, we're a little over, but I'm trying to help you because this is an exam you got to take coming up for each student. This is the cream of the crop here. This is actually, I tell people, some of the things that you see here, you'll see when you take this quiz. Now, I'm going to let you tell me. The intent to cause death with premeditation is considered what type of murder? Excellent. A father comes home to find his daughter's 17-year-old boyfriend, of whom he doesn't approve, about to have sexual intercourse with his daughter. Outraged, the father kills the boyfriend. The father is likely to claim what? You're on it. Very good. And then the last one I'm going to do. John, 18-year-old, and Jack, 19-year-old, decided to drag race on a busy roadway in an entertainment district. During the illegal act of racing on the roadway, John drove through a red light at a high rate of speed and killed another motorist. The most likely criminal charge that John will face is what? This is a tricky one. Involuntary manslaughter? Okay. Well, there you go. Excellent. You didn't go for the second-degree murder, because some people would have. John's reckless actions, remember, but there was no premeditation or intent. And so that's the kind of stuff that you're going to see, you're going to run into when you have your exam. And that's why each week, each of the weeks, if you go back to week 2, you're going to see the same kind of little things that can help you. And you say, oh, wow. Now, your brain was popping, bam, bam, bam. But the point of the matter is this, is that that's the same way you got to be doing with that. Remember, your time's going to be moving, and you got to do those quizzes. All right? So, I'm going to say good night to you, but I'm going to give you this. Give me homicide. Give me that, you get your points. You're welcome. You're welcome. Does it help you when we show you how to use those practice items at the end? Do those help you a lot? Are they helpful? Those little practice tests that we do, the little practice scenarios, does that help you to review yourself of the material so it sticks to you a little bit more? Yes or no? Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you for coming out today, and get those assignments completed. And of course, you know any questions, how to reach out to me anytime but the 25th hour of the day. And I'm going to say good night and see you next week at the same time. Have a good week and a good evening.